But so hi, there we go. Hi, I'm Kathy O'Brien. So I'm a research fellow in human computer interaction at UCL, and today I'll be presenting our paper on online dating platform safeguards and self-protections on behalf of the UseCRT project team. So this work really discusses the results of a platform-based document review in which we analyze the documentation related to platform behaviors in order to look at how the five most popular dating platforms in the UK characterize, address, and safeguard against online harms. So in this presentation, what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about the UseCRT project, a bit about the context of online dating in general, and then about our research questions in this paper, our methodology, and then our key findings and sort of discussion points. Really, the main sort of takeaways from this presentation are going to be around the structure that we've been developing for characterizing harms, and then our insights around how online dating platforms sort of seek to balance user and platform responsibilities. Um, so. So the UseCRT project basically aims to evaluate the user experience and usability of content reporting tools across the most popular social media platforms in the UK, and specifically going to be investigating this within the context of online harassment as defined by the platforms themselves. So to do this, we'll be undertaking an analysis of platform-specific behavior policies and documentation, user interface inspections of reporting tools, and then a user study to understand how people's mental models as they interact with these reporting tools. The social media platforms that we're going to be looking at are across four different categories. So that's social media, instant messaging, online dating, and online gaming. And then this work will be conducted over three work packages. So the first one involves a rapid platform-specific and governance-based document review. The second will be a heuristic walkthrough of web and mobile platform content reporting tools. And the third will be a scenario-based think aloud study. So in this paper, I'm going to be focused on just the online dating platforms, and this work is just situated in this first work package. So online dating platforms really play a significant role in contemporary dating practices. And while they expand dating opportunities for users, they also expose them to harms. So importantly, really, that online dating platforms have different risks compared to other platforms. It's because they really differ in their nature, because compared to other social media platforms, what online dating wants to do is facilitate connections that mean you move off platform. That's always the ultimate goal. So, while prior research that was conducted by PATA in 2016 has characterized how social media platforms in general define harms related to harassment, there hasn't been any prior work that's looking at how online dating platforms characterize harms and how they report to safeguard users against harmful behaviors. So, that's what this work is aiming to do. So, the three research questions that we're looking at are: how do online dating platforms characterize platform harms? What do online dating platforms say about how they respond to platform behavior violations? And what safeguards do online dating platforms say they put in place to keep their users safe? So, unlike offline traditional dating, which typically fosters trust through face-to-face interactions in a shared social context, online dating is really characterized by computer-mediated communication that takes place at initially a physical distance. And this physical distance has a sort of associated relative anonymity that can be used to facilitate the sort of deceptive self-presentation, that's the sort of thing that scammers do. Also, the necessity for sharing personal information about yourself in order to make connections with others. And then features as well, like location tracking, can also facilitate in-person risks like stalking and harassment. Sexual harm is, of course, another really serious concern with online dating environments, particularly for women and LGBTQ plus individuals, as well as other vulnerable populations. There are also, for vulnerable populations, particularly risks related to hate speech and discrimination in the online dating context. It's also really important that we recognize the intersectionality of identity, right? So that, we can think about how heightened risks can be heightened when marginalized individuals encounter sort of compound vulnerabilities in online spaces. But all this being said, we should also acknowledge that there is work that sort of problematizes the notion that online dating is inherently riskier than other forms of dating. So dating apps largely have often been criticized for inadequate safety measures, such as insufficient privacy controls or a lack of abuse prevention features. And these things can, render users vulnerable to different forms of dating violence. However, a lot of the platforms have implemented automated content moderation systems that can detect potentially violating or harmful content. So, for example, Badoo and Bumble both have feature where they blur explicit images so that can protect users from potential sexual harassment. And Tinder moderates chats on platform for problematic messages, and others have sort of automated tools that can assist human moderators with detecting things like scams. So Dati and Zytco have highlighted the potential for other tools, so AI-based risk detection technologies that could be used to assist women in sort of assessing potential harms and risks associated with online dating. So this would be combining a proactive sort of detection tool with users' sort of personal preferences, so they can mitigate risks themselves. However, approaches like this, while they're proactive and sort of scalable, so those are great things, there are concerns related to bias and privacy sort of coming from the associations with AI. Comparatively, user reporting as a detecting method really hasn't faced the same sort of scrutiny as these more proactive methods. Sort of mostly because really, because one participant is consenting to disclosing all this information. So similarly to other reactive features like blocking or panic buttons that you can have for in-person interactions, user reporting is something that shifts responsibility onto the user post-harm. This being said, some other proactive measures like concealing location data or Bumble's women messaging first rule have faced criticism as well because they've been deemed to have limited effectiveness. And as well as all these sort of tools, we know that educational initiatives have proven really useful in reducing risks in online dating abuse as well. So in order to select our platforms, we used the 5 most popular in the 2024 UK survey commissioned by Ofcom. So these are Tinder, Hinge, Bumble, Grindr, and Badoo. And then for all of these platforms, we were interested in both their formal documentation, so that's things that are legally binding, like a terms of service, and informal documentation, and so that's non-legally binding, so that could be like community guidelines. So documents across the selected platforms were identified initially through a manual review of each platform's website, where we went through the terms of service and sort of just opened up and identified any other references to additional documentation. And then following this, we conducted a search using key terms that was selected on the basis of their inclusion in other prior work. So then to analyze these documents, we used an inductive coding approach and collaboratively developed a collaboratively develop a code book. And this was because this was part of the wider UseCRT project. Our code book was developed using documents that came from across all 4 of the platform categories, and this happened over 3 rounds of coding. So once we'd established this code book, we were then able to do a deductive analysis to go across all 118 of the online dating platform documents. So then in this paper, what we do is we report on sort of 5 of the main themes that developed in our analysis. And the first of these was harm characterization. So all platforms characterize harms in terms of sort of broad behaviors. So these include things like doxing, manipulation, violence. And while some of these harms are explicitly defined by the platforms, most of them aren't. So while the majority of harms are characterized as acts or behaviors, some of them are also characterized as things like incitement, so that would be like inciting violence, promotions, don't promote harmful behavior, threats, like don't send threatening messages. And then all of the platforms also differentiate certain harms based on the target. So this could be children, just individuals in general, or groups. And then also whether these individuals or groups have protected characteristics or not, and then the self as well. And platforms also differentiate behaviors based on whether they were repetitive, the scale at which they occurred, like mass harassment, or Yeah, so repetitive intentionality or scale. And then, so for each of the harms we identified, sometimes it could be characterized by all three of these. Other times it might be one or two. So it could be that also you have multiple of some of the codes. So there might be multiple targets, like it could be targeting individuals and groups, or it could be both intentional and sustained. So it's not one size fits all, but I've got an example here for you. So, so you can see here that the nature of the harm is going to be a sort of identity-based attacks in the form of slurs or epithets. And then the target would be either groups or individuals with protected characteristics because it's talking about identity-based. And then the harm approach is coded as intentional because you see to cause harm sort of implies this intentionality there. Another theme that we explored in the paper was how enforcement actions for violations of community guidelines were reported by all of the platforms. So some of these were really similar across all of them. So all platforms reported on account suspension and removal, content removal, sending warnings or nudges, and then also mentioned that they had the potential or that they might contact law enforcement as well if they deemed it severe enough. Then Tinder was the only platform that mentioned restricting the visibility of content, and Grindr was the only platform that mentioned requesting users actually remove their own content from the platform. So Badoo, Bumble, and Hinge also mention actions related to suspending off-platform accounts when they're owned by the same company. So Badoo and Bumble are owned by the same company, and Hinge and Tinder are as well. And then all of the platforms also mentioned harm severity in relation to the enforcement actions that they take. All platforms also employed safety tools and other safeguarding measures within the app to protect their users. And all of them, apart from Badoo, cautioned users against taking your interactions off the platform too quickly because they want to keep you there where they have these tools. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So the first would be they all had safety tools that were sort of either automatically implemented or that the user themselves could apply to protect themselves. So Badoo, Bumble, Hinge, and Tinder all had it that when you report a user, they're then automatically blocked, so they can't contact you anymore. But on Grindr, you can report, but then you also it's your responsibility to then separately block the sort of offending user. We also found that some platforms embed proactive content moderation features. So on Hinge and Tinder, who are owned by Match, they have this "Are you sure" feature, which detects harmful content before it's sent and prompts the user to reconsider the language that they're using. So this feature places responsibility on the sender, but then there are others that detect harmful content once it's been received. So this could be the things I was mentioning earlier around sort of like blurring or flagging content to protect users. And all of the platforms had some form of this kind of technology. So either protecting against things like rude or offensive language or potential nude or sexually explicit content. So the platforms recognized that LGBTQ plus users faced additional risks, and both Grindr and Tinder had safety features that were sort of targeted specifically at protecting this wider group. So on Tinder, this includes things like proactively warning LGBTQ plus members of risks when they travel to countries where the law targets community people in this community. So it would do things like also advise them to remove their sexual orientation from their profile when they're in that country. Grindr also had features like discrete app icons that you could use yourself to hide the app on your device, as well as PIN code protection. So all of these tools are obviously very specific to the user group to help them from off-platform harms as well. All of the platforms also used third-party content and sort of signposted to different types of support. So there was a lot of support for suicidal or self-injurious behaviors, as well as victims of sexual or physical abuse. So some platforms signposted resources that were targeted at people with specific protected characteristics, particularly race or LGBTQ plus status. And then these resources were sort of developed to target specific things like mental health, experiences of physical violence, or maybe like hate and discrimination. But some of these resources were also geographically restricted. So things like BrightCheck, which is a criminal background check service that was signposted by Tinder, was actually only available in the US. So we've got some limits there. There was also a lot of guidance around consent, both on and off platform. And this sort of dictates what behavior was acceptable or not around sexually explicit material. So you could, on Badoo, Bumble, Grindr, and Tinder, you could send sexually explicit messages if the other party consented, but none of the platforms would allow you to post any sexually explicit material in your public profile content because obviously no one could consent to seeing this. All of the platforms looked at defining consent and sort of educating their users around that in terms of in-person interactions as well. Grindr and Tinder sort of even had sort of how to check in with sexual partners, educating users on how to read things like body language and verbal cues. So this is one sort of aspect of safety guidance, but then all of the platforms had multiple safety guides on different areas and topics. Sort of ranging from things like sharing personal information on app to notifying your friends and family if you're meeting up with someone. So in this way, the platform sort of puts the responsibility of caution onto the user and sort of they're making their own decisions as to what they want to do rather than explicitly banning something and saying don't share personal information in messages. It just cautions users as to when and why it probably isn't ever appropriate to share sort of really personal information. And then, so really this speaks to the next sort of major theme, which was user responsibility for safety. So it was by all of the platforms, safety was sort of established as in part, the responsibility of the user. And particularly this was the case for off-platform interactions. So Bumble, Grindr, Hinge, and Tinder all tell their users, you need to apply caution, and particularly for LGBTQ plus users when in certain regions, they need to be thinking and having a common sense approach, and offered some additional guidance around this as well. Then you had Tinder, as I've mentioned, encouraged users in the US to conduct criminal background checks, and sort of paralleling that, Bumble advised users to research their own matches independently. So they say, it's always okay to do a little homework before meeting a new person in real life. Do they have any skeletons big enough to have made the news? Are they a webmaster for a popular Buffy fan page? It never hurts to know these things early. So then, they're really putting that on the user there. And then in addition, Bumble, Grindr, and Tinder were sort of urging users to think about self-care and what they need if they encounter any kind of harms. So while enforcement is always the responsibility of the platform, the platform also makes it clear that it's the user who's responsible for reporting in a lot of cases. So this is also to do with calling out bad behavior in others and sort of intervening as a bystander through user reporting. So while they have these automated detection tools that they deploy and they have human moderators, user reporting was really the most frequently mentioned form of detecting policy violations. And sort of to encourage this, they often made references to being sort of confidential and anonymous. And again, all of them were sort of balancing this idea of there's a dual function to user reporting, both to protect the self and to protect the community and other users. And all platforms recommended users unmatch or block instead of reporting where behavior didn't actually violate a policy, because false reporting itself is considered a prohibited behavior. So this was something platforms were particularly aware of, particularly for users who could be victimized because of protected characteristics. And so while user reporting is encouraged, it's not the user's responsibility to decide what is a violation, basically. Sorry, I'm realizing we're running out of time. So on to the discussion. Basically, there are three main points. So the first is that platforms need to balance user responsibility and platform responsibility because of the nature of online dating, where you move off platform. And so they have these top-down safety mechanisms and proactive content moderation, and sort of different tools that can enhance safety in-app. But then they also need to encourage positive, safe behavior in users when they move off the platform and beyond these mechanisms. So yeah, safe dating strategy advice was really common. Lots of emphasis on consent, and perhaps compared to consent apps, which have sort of been criticized, sort of subverting sexual agency. Instead, putting this emphasis on education, when you teach users like how to identify consent and how to practice good consent, it allows them to retain their own agency in their sexual encounters, and promotes personal and community safety as well. We've also got sort of a tension between platform guidance and safeguarding tools and recommendations, because these tools can be exploited by bad actors to engage in prohibited behaviors. So, for example, Bumble and Grindr say don't screenshot, because, and they also say doxing and non-consensual sharing is prohibited in all circumstances. But then actually they're saying, you could screenshot someone's information and send it to your friends, and then they'll know where you are, or even some other platforms recommending doing criminal background checks and doing research on others, when actually this is something that they say don't stalk, don't online cyber stalk, don't look at people's other social media. So there's sort of this conflict. Um, and also a lot of ambiguous language in some of the informal documentation, particularly sort of saying things like Badoo, Bumble, Hinge, and Tinder all say, don't you can report anything that makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe. But then this is something that's gives a justification perhaps to false reporting, because you're allowed to report it, but what is it that makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe? And that could be used for victimizing particularly marginalized community members on platforms. Just trying to get through this quicker. So also there's, as I've mentioned, geographical differences in terms of access to external safety tools and resources. So these things, as I've mentioned, vary by group, but also by region. So most of the resources are tailored to the US and Canada. LGBTQ plus users receive the most tailored protections, despite protected attributes being mentioned by all the platforms broadly. There was no resources aimed at some groups like people with disabilities, things like that. So it sort of raises questions around equity in platform safety design and the need for sort of more inclusive and comprehensive safeguarding strategies to account for intersectional vulnerabilities. So one way forward might be collaborating with marginalized user groups to sort of uncover specific safety concerns and sort of look at where these diverge and overlap and tailor sort of safeguarding measures, either through tools or through guidance. So we could do something like consulting different marginalized groups on their existing self-protecting practices that they sort of have developed themselves, both on and off platform. And then you could look at developing this into guidance specific to the capabilities of the platforms themselves. So that's it. I've had to rush through the end there, but it's all in our paper, which was accepted as a late-breaking work to the conference Chi, which you can access through the QR code up there. But if you have any questions, also please feel free to reach out to me, Kathy, or the project's PI, Mark Warner. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath. That was a really interesting talk. I'm going to open up the floor for any questions while we're running a little bit short of time, but yeah, you can reach out to Kathy there. Just very quickly, can you advise how this work's going to feed into the next work phase of the the UCRT project, and what kind of impact you expect this to be having more broadly?
Yeah, so this is really just looking at the online dating platforms in the first work package. So, initially we'd thought that this part of the work, this review of the documentation was going to be quite quick, because in the PATA paper, which is the sort of 2016 most recent similar work, there was only about 50 odd documents, and we've identified, I think it's about 635. So we're going through them now, and we're conducting this first work package. And really, I think what's going to be interesting is comparing not just between platforms, but across platform categories as well. So looking at the differences in, well, what are the harms associated with harassment on online dating compared to instant messaging or compared to online gaming.
Okay, so yeah, that sounds really interesting. Does anyone else have any questions? If you want to just raise your hand, you can be invited, or if you don't feel comfortable doing so, you're happy to put it in the chat directly. I'll give you a minute or so.
Hi, Killian. Have you got your hand up?
Hi, yeah, thanks, Kelly, for the talk. That was really interesting. I was just wondering, so was there any mention of in all of these documents about like how different communities would approach like things like reporting differently? So, for example, you said about there's this conflict between uh, telling people to report things that make them feel uncomfortable, but at the same time, you don't want to report, you don't want to have any false reporting. Might there be like, if you're a woman who might be more likely to be victimized, or maybe you're LGBTQ or something like this, you would imagine that you'd want sort of less stringent rules there, where they should be encouraged to report more or something like this, or, or
Yeah.
or anything across the board from the policies, or any kind of differences in that area, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think the main thing was that they were really, really conscious of false reporting against people with on the basis of gender identity or being trans. That was the main thing. So while they had all this very ambiguous, uncomfortable, unsafe, I think it was only Grindr that didn't use those exact terms, uncomfortable or unsafe, as a reason for reporting. They were all incredibly conscious of the fact that they're not acknowledging that they're using, obviously very open language, but that false reporting does happen all the time and against particular groups. Some of the platforms had really, really specific. So Grindr, for example, was probably the most permissive in terms of um, sort of like revealing skin in images on a public profile. But they had incredibly specific guidelines with like diagrams and things illustrating what would constitute appropriate and what wouldn't. Others were far more relaxed in it. And I think what will be really interesting is also going forward from online dating, where, of course, you're encouraging people to make romantic connections, comparing that to other platforms like. For example, on social media, when you look at the policy documents involved in LinkedIn, there's really, of course, no room for any kind of behavior like this. So I think it's comparing what is deemed appropriate or not in terms of harassment, and particularly again also what is sexually harassing in this context as well.
Great, thanks very much.
One more minute for any other questions, perhaps. But yeah, as mentioned, Kathy's details are up there. If you prefer to take it offline. All right, I think we might be done here. But yeah, thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you everyone for coming. Um, that's really interesting talking. Yeah, look forward to seeing you at the Fringe Showcase. Right,
Great.
thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.